So just to jump in, I think this is quite an interesting one in that we've had a new strategy from the CQC this year, and this is just to frame the beginning of this conversation. Um, and then after the strategy, they've started to make some changes, and then in July they published this statement on their website, which was they're introducing a monthly review of the information they have on most of the services they regulate. But to start with, this will not include primary dental care services. Um, I think there's a couple of reasons for that. I think sort of logistically because NHS practices, and we'll see this later on in the presentation. For NHS practices, the CQC can sort of up how they're getting data. They want to cross the threshold and walk into practices less, and they want to be able to assess remotely more. And that's easier to get. Well, you can go to the BSA and you can get like the vital signs information, things like that, to look for outliers and indicators, so they can get information on NHS practices. But for private practices, I think they're still trying to figure that out, because that data just doesn't exist apart from within the practices themselves, which I think is quite interesting. So I think, and then on the other side of it, we're relatively low risk as a profession compared with the other professions and the other sectors of the other healthcare sectors. We are relatively low risk. So I think the CQC have got a very ambitious strategy, as we'll see, but I think we're quite low on that list of when that's going to change us, because what you can see here is this will not really include primary care dental services. These changes of regularly looking at a practice on a monthly basis, which I think will come for us, or something will come that is similar, and you'll see this more towards the end of the presentation. But I think for now they're prioritizing, which is good for us. And I think next year is going to be relatively quiet and very little change. Now, another thing they did is they did a primary care webinar on the 29th of September this year, and they spent a large chunk of this webinar. It was a primary care webinar, so included dental, and they spent the majority of this webinar, which is on YouTube on their channel, discussing how they were going to bring in this monthly model of assessing. And you can see it if you go and look at GP practices at the moment. They will say, we have reviewed this practice for November and there's no change to rating. So they are creating this intelligence and this monitoring system. But for dentistry, they did this webinar, and then they basically said at the bottom there was the sort of the last quote they said, which was in a nutshell, no real changes to dentistry. This text here is not verbatim. This is just our sort of a mixture of what they said and was our analysis at the time. But essentially what they've said is that for this year, they're still crossing the threshold and inspecting practices, but they've switched the TMA calls, the transitional monitoring, which we'll discuss more a little bit, to the direct monitoring calls, which from what we can tell is exactly the same question set at the moment. And they're not publishing off the back of those, which is something else we'll talk about. But you can see that they're trying to do more of these calls, and whether or not they cross the threshold is whether or not that call triggers something. But that's not really very different to what they've been doing for the last 12 months during the pandemic. So in a nutshell, they're ramping up a little bit. As it says, there's approximately 4,000 practices that just haven't been inspected. So they've still got a massive backlog of dental practices to inspect. And they're looking at outstanding compliance actions from previous inspections. They're looking at focusing on practices where they've received concern, but there's nothing in any of the communication that's coming out of the CQC that really tells us what's going to happen with industry when they're implementing this new strategy. So as you'll see sort of later on in the presentation, we're going to sort of have a look at the strategy and pull out, and I'm going to pull together threads of what I think is coming. And some of the things I'm sure will happen. I think the majority will happen. Some of them most likely won't happen. That's the deal with predicting. But hopefully you can follow the thought process and you can see why we're coming to these thoughts and what we think is going on. So passing assessment in 2022, which is what this webinar is about, is not going to be very different to passing assessment in 2021. However, there's some new hot topics that are coming out from research. SOP compliance is, we're seeing we've looked at every failed inspection report from April this year when they really started inspecting again. So you can see what they're really looking at on your COVID-19 SOP compliance, and we've pulled that out. So knowing what's in the SOP compliance, knowing the hot topics of what they're looking at, knowing your key 2015 to 2021 themes, which is when the CQC really brought out the fundamental standards, the key lines of inquiry, and the CQC really sort of clarify what it is they're looking for, which I think is going to change or be reduced slightly. And we're going to have a look at that. We'll look at exploring their strategy, and we'll discuss about, having a trusted partner. It doesn't need to be us. I hope that it would be us for those of you who aren't members. But I think it's really important. There's change coming, and I think having managed a lot of practices myself and then been a consultant and then ended up where I am today, I think any practice trying to manage compliance or do the research without a team, it's just not operationally very efficient these days because there's a lot going on. I know how much we need to do to stay on top of what we do for our members. So I think having a trusted partner is very, very important. So I'll tell you why that could be us, but it doesn't have to be us. So CQC's timeline, just to give a little bit of background, obviously in 2010, they started inspecting. 2015, we saw a new strategy. The fundamental standards came in. The key lines of inquiry came in. We had inspection changes, and we got to this 10% frequency, which if they're super strict about it, it means a practice is going to be inspected once every 10 years, which is something that we'll see that they want to move away from because, how can you say that this practice is fine now if you looked at it 9 years ago? So is it really, saying anything about the practice that you had an inspection 7-8 years ago or something like that? So they need to move away from that and be more of a real-time regulator, which is the language they're using, not a point-in-time inspection. In 2018, we saw the 11 sets of key lines of inquiry for all the different healthcare merge into two, one for social care and one for healthcare. Then 2020, we had the inspection pause because of the pandemic, and transitional monitoring, the TMA, came in, which is now being called the DMA, direct monitoring approach. Subtleties of which are not quite clear yet. And then obviously 2021, we've had a new strategy, smarter regulation. They want to be more digital. They want to be more remote. They want to cross the threshold less often. And they've got their focus on safe, effective, and well-led. And I think what's interesting is the difference between the 2021 and the 2015 sort of change. And this is probably because of the pandemic, and resources. Is that in 2015, or just leading up to 2015, with these changes, we got very, very clear guidance. We had draft handbooks from the CQC, provider handbooks with consultations on the content, and they were discussing their inspection approach. So there was this a lot of activity around dentistry and dental inspection, which we're not seeing right now. And I don't think that's because I don't think there's anything negative about that. I think, as I said earlier, obviously with the pandemic and prioritising, the CQC have put together quite an ambitious strategy, and they're taking their time to implement it. And because we're low risk, I think we're potentially at the end of that chain. But we can get a sense of what is coming, and we can see that through the wording in the strategy and things that they've said publicly as well. So quickly running through sort of if you're going to be assessed next year, which is most likely they'll try a remote call with you and then they'll inspect you if that remote call doesn't go well. I think they're using Teams a lot at the moment. These are the key things that have come out of the last sort of the inspection regime from 2015 to 2021 and some more recent things. So just being well led is really important. Personnel files and recruitment, especially now, and especially when there's a recruitment crisis, you're going to want to get people on. If you find someone, you're going to want to get them on very, very quickly. And when you have to get a DBS check, maybe you'll do that a little bit later because you just want to get them on board or something like that. So right now, there's a real focus on that. Again, I mean, there always has been. It's really, really important. My two favorite topics for anyone who's ever seen me talk: risk assessment / auditing and competence and the mistakes. We've got 2,100 practices using iComply, growing every single day, and these are the two things that I think practices still don't quite get right. and it's very much around competence and who you give it to, and you're still seeing this come out on inspection reports. Infection control, we'll get to that. I think the bottom line with infection control is that HTM 105 has been around for 10 years, was slightly changed in 2013, but we really need to have got it right by now. So there's sort of, I've got a slide on that, but I imagine I'm preaching to the converted with the people on this webinar. Talk a bit about the COVID-19 focus, as I said earlier, what's in the SOPs, and then I'll just pull out some hot topic research. So being well led, I'm going to go super fast with this because, as I said, we've got a lot of slides, and I've got a whole webinar on this, on how to be well led, and it's on multiple webinars. But essentially, allocate time to compliance. The practices that don't, or it's almost universal, the practices that are really bad with their compliance are the practices who literally don't schedule any time for it. And time management, and I appreciate at the moment time is precious, but if you don't put diary time in your diary to stay on top of it, then you will fall behind on it. So it needs to be managed, which maybe sounds really obvious. Building flex into your business, I won't go into that too much because we're in a recruitment crisis. Hopefully when we're out of it sometime, there can be a lot of benefit for slightly overstaffing, because what you can find is if you did a sort of a time study and time money study over a certain number of years, what you'd probably find is that it's cheaper to slightly overstaff than to use temps when it comes up. But obviously that's on a business by business basis, but I've done that with businesses or had a look at people who've done that, and it does work. Leadership, learn, compliance. I think bottom line, to be well led, if you're the registered manager, if you're the owner, then you're the only permanent team member that you have. Everyone else, we always say, if a team member won the lottery, ask your team, if you won the lottery, you're going to be here tomorrow. And they don't necessarily have, unless they've got share options or something like that, they don't have a vested interest in the business. So firstly, obviously, for that reason, if you're the practice owner, how can you ever know whether your manager is doing a good job on compliance if you don't understand it, and if you don't understand the guidelines or what they're trying to do? Obviously, the regulatory duty aside from that, and then staying up to date with the compliance, because things do change. Coming to webinars like this, going on courses, we're planning some fantastic days for next year, some fantastic events. Investing in a system. Obviously, I'm completely biased being involved in a system, but having managed this in a practice myself, having managed it in a group, I can't imagine doing it without one. Training your team and double checking. Delegation. A lot of practices not a lot of practices. No, sorry. Some practices will delegate without training. How can your infection control lead do your audit and be your infection control lead if they're not qualified, if they've read HTML 105 once and they don't know the right or wrong answers on the audits? So you need to train. Double checking and creating a culture of quality, which is a whole thing on culture creation, which is on one of my separate webinars. But just being well led is one of the key things they're looking at. Audits, always important. And I think it's always important to talk about them because it's a key area that practices fall down, and they generally fall down on one of these four areas. The first one is they misunderstand what the legal status is of some of the audits. They don't realize that say the IRMA audits, the radiograph quality audits, those are legal requirements. So you're technically breaching regulations if you don't do them. So it's a very easy way for the CQC to pull you up on inspection. So misunderstanding that they are legal requirements, except for the clinical records audit. Which really, the bottom line with the clinical records audit is, would you prefer the CQC to look at your associates' records, or would you prefer them to look at your records audit? So I think it's very, very important. Misunderstanding of quality assurance workflow, misunderstanding that an audit is not just ticking the boxes on the sheet. And realizing that it's part of a process where you're gathering data, you're analyzing, you're following up, and you're then looking to improve the practice. So misunderstanding that the audit, or just not getting that the audit is just part of a flow, and it's an activity within a quality assurance framework and not something you do to pass an inspection. Lack of subject knowledge and/or competence. We've spoken about that just before, but the sort of things you see with this, and I've seen this, I remember once, probably 2019, I visited 3 practices within 3 months and saw this exact same issue where the audit, one of them was the infection control audit had been given to someone who wasn't trained, and they got to the question which said, do you have any nail brushes by your taps? And they'd put no nail brushes, not realizing that you're not supposed to have nail brushes, and they went out and they bought nail brushes and put nail brushes by every sink. And I've told that story loads of times, but I'll continue to tell it. Or the X-ray quality audit, where the nurse who was not X-ray qualified, who'd been given the audit, had put that the audit was 100% success because all of the dentists for the last 3 years had got grade 1 on their X-rays. All 5 dentists for 3 years had never shot anything lower than a 1. So, which is statistically impossible, but she didn't realize that. So obviously there was a bigger issue going on there on multiple sides. And I mentioned about follow up in the process there. So skipping past that one, 5 rules for auditing, just very quickly: know your guidance, know your procedures internally, never assume, go and look. Don't sit there with the audit form on a desk and go, we definitely do that. Go and check, because what you'll find is that you're probably not doing it. Don't give yourselves the benefit of the doubt. You're auditing yourselves, so be tougher rather than being nicer, and ask, could you prove it? You can always see a lot of language. Language is really interesting, especially if you're auditing and you're asking the team. If you say to the team, what do we do? And they say, well, we should do this, or we will do that, rather than we do this and here is the evidence, then watching out for language is quite important, but also thinking, how could I prove this to an inspector? How could I prove in 6 months' time that we did something on a particular day? We have, in iComply, we have created digital audits, which we've got 5 in there right now, including the infection control audit, which I like to think is like the IPS audit tool, but just better in that it knows the right or wrong answers. It will give action plans for you, and it will give suggestions on why that might have happened as well. So we've used some of the investment that we've got when we've become Agilio to build what I think are probably the best auditing tools available in for practices at the moment. So if you're on this call and you're not a member and you're interested in having a look at something like this, then a pop-up will come up in a second, and we've extended the Black Friday offer for this webinar. So I think you can get your first 3 months for free on our standard contract. So if you are interested in just having a chat with the new business team, having a look at some of this stuff, it's no obligation, it's free. I think the link will take you directly to a calendar, so you can have a look at that and talk about the stuff that we've got coming, which I've got at the end, some of the exciting stuff that we're working on as well at the end of this presentation. If you stick around for that, it'd be nice to tell you guys what we're planning as well. Can't tell you everything, but it's very, very exciting and rapid production of interesting products and services. Okay, so quickly going into recruitment and appraisal. I'm not going to go on a big list on this one, but basically, as always, you've got to have a recruitment policy or procedure that's in line with the Schedule 3 requirements. So some of these things on the left, full employment history, gaps in employment explained, having the enhanced DBS certificate. I probably should have said proof of DBS certification, because you should only keep it for so long. Proof of identity. These are things that are in the regulation. So again, very easy to fail on an inspection if you're not following Schedule 3 of the Health and Social Care Act, which says certain things that you must have on file. The way we handle this in the system is we give people a staff file checklist, which covers these things and highlights what you should be doing. And on average, the CQC are looking at 4 staff files checked per inspection, and they are. That was pre-pandemic. We've not got a stat on that for post-pandemic, but it's probably still the same. But it's very easy to fall down. I'd say most practices I go to, if I go through the files, I'm going to find one DBS missing, or a reference isn't there. Obviously, the references you only need from 2015 when that regulation came in. Good to have them from before. For everyone employed from 2015 onwards, good to have them from before. But I won't go into that in loads of detail. But really easy way to fall down on your inspections and not have your personnel files. And generally speaking, biggest culprits are the practice owner's file. It's either perfect or it's not there. So it's one of the two, generally never in the middle. And the other one is your visiting implantologist who comes every 3rd full moon or something like that. Again, either great, they've given you everything on a stick, or they're giving you nothing, usually one of the two. So if I know where to look, then so do the CQC. Your new starter as well. New starter is always a good one, to check, as it were. And what have we done about this for our members is if you are an IT member, we've got this software, and you can probably see on the right there's something that's called compulsory document status. So we've used our what we know about dentistry to build the first ever the first ever dental HR software that is. It's HR operations software because it's a lot more than, it's not just a simple HR system, because it identifies when you add a new starter, it says what role have they got, and then it sends them an email asking them for all these documents, and you can see the status of, do you have their GDC, do you have their indemnity, etc. on the right. So that's fantastic. So some of you are iComply members, and you're looking for this sort of a system, then this is dental specific, and you can sort of change your contract to what we call a Gilio one. I won't go on about, I'm not here to chat about that too much, but you've got that option as well, and the pop-up will come up at some point, probably not on this slide because I just had it up, but when that comes up, if you're interested in having a chat about this software, we've been working really hard to build dental specific software. Oh, it has come up again. Right, okay, so now moving on to risk assessment. So we've spoken about audits, and we've spoken about audits and staff files. Risk assessment's really easy way to fall down. Easy way to fall down, and generally it's usually because the person who's doing the risk assessment is not competent. They don't know what they're doing with they don't understand risk assessment principles, they don't understand risk assessment scoring, and they don't understand how to use a risk assessment template. I'd say the minimum qualification for someone to do a health and safety risk assessment, obviously this is just my opinion, but I'd say it's the opinion of a Gilio. The minimum sort of level you want for someone to do a risk assessment in your business, and this is probably just health and safety, not fire, not Legionella, is IOSH, managing safely. So there's an organization called IOSH, IOSH. They do a 3-day course, and I would really strongly advise going on the course for 3 days, going away and sitting in a room. It's what the people who write risk assessments internally with us and people on our team, it's the minimum level people have on our team. And you learn what risk assessment is, and you learn how to use a template. Again, that sort of qualifies you probably for health. Well, doesn't qualify you, because it's not about qualifications, it's about feeling competent and being competent. I'd say for most people that will give them a level of competence to be able to assess a risk assessment or write one. For something like health and safety, for fire, I would use an external expert for fire, because I don't know what thickness the fire doors need to be in the latest guidance, and I think it's a big risk. So common errors: practices use a template and they don't add risks specific to their practice, or they don't remove risks. So that they've got a template like one of ours and they've left lasers in the template and they don't have lasers. They do not remove or add control measures. So a lot of these templates like ours have template control measures in square brackets to make it easy to save time for practices to adopt them. But then they'll leave in, around safer sharps, they'll say they have them, they don't have them, they're resheathing, they're not resheathing, and they just leave everything in the risk assessment. And then obviously it looks like it's an unadopted document, which to an inspector is a smoking gun, because as soon as they see that, they're then going to go and look at your other documents. And they can think, well, if they haven't edited this one properly, what other ones have they not edited properly? Practices misunderstand risk scoring. Risk scoring is likelihood multiplied by severity. If an autoclave explodes, the severity is potentially death. If you put control measures in place, you just reduce the likelihood, not the severity. Generally speaking, control measures reduce the likelihood, not the severity, if it happens. So, you may take an autoclave from so say 1 to 3, a 3 by 3 of likelihood by severity, so a total risk score of 9, and then you put the control measures in, and it'll become a 1 times 3, because you've reduced the likelihood, but you haven't reduced the severity. But you'll get people on risk assessment putting 1 times 1. So they're misunderstanding, and they're just going through and putting 1s on the risk assessment form. So yeah, I've said practices score severity too low, and they perform it without training. So going past that one, infection control really quickly, getting your accurate 6 monthly audits with follow-up and improvement. Accuracy is a problem in practices, I'd say, still these days, some practices, because of who they are allowing to do this risk assessment. Training helps with that. Having the sort of software that we have in iComply helps with that, because the software knows the right answers. You're still required to do an annual statement on infection control. In our system, that's M258A. And that's because that's with the code of practice that is linked with legislation. Fully completed logs and correct testing. This is just a really easy one. What you'll sometimes see on an infection control audit is we have, there's a question where it's like, how good are your logs for your machines? Score 1 to 4. 1 we have everything, 4 we have nothing. And people score the 1, but then you go and look at the logs, and and there's been days when there's temps have been in, so the logs are just incomplete for that day. So you don't have full records, you have partial records, but your auditor has said you've got full records. So there's multiple issues going on in the practice. So just some things to be aware of there. And immunization records, obviously this is changing next year, and we're going to have to introduce for the vaccine, for the COVID-19 vaccine as well. Obviously they're not looking at it now, but they will be next year. Right, so those are your core things I'd say to take from, before we move on to what's coming. We've got a little bit on what's going on now. Those are the core things I'd take away from what's happened over the last 5 years and what will definitely stay. At the end of the day, the CQC may be changing the way they inspect, the way they look at things, but the CQC, the regulations are the regulations and the guidance is the guidance. That stuff's not changing. So the CQC might look at less, which we'll get to, which is really interesting because this is something that we're thinking about here, is the CQC, when they come into your practice, they have a lot of power to look at a lot of things. What they choose to look at that time or that day or that year may change. But the guidance and the regulations, it's not the CQC who make the rules, they're like the police. So don't look for any major changes in compliance. What the major changes is in how the CQC are looking at you and what they're looking at that time. But again, if they weren't looking at GDPR in a particular year and they came in and they just said, oh, can we just have a look at one of your GDPR docs, and you couldn't give them anything, or what you gave to them didn't really meet the regulations or didn't look good, they have full authority and full power to start digging and start looking. So you want to maintain a high level of compliance and not only think about what the CQC are looking for. However, we're going to be helping our members with this, which is something interesting I'll touch on later. So COVID-19 compliance, obviously, we've had the pandemic, we've had SOPs and guidance is coming out thick and fast. I think the self-isolation guidance seems to be changing on a monthly, if not weekly basis, and the dental appendix has been pending a new version for, I'm not sure how long now. I think it was a month ago we heard there was a new version just around the corner. So just on that, having a sort of a point-to-point SOP, an SOP that literally covers from the moment the patient calls you to the moment they walk out of the practice. You need to cover that whole trail, and there's multiple procedures within that. I think an SOP is a standard operating procedures, which is why we built ours like a bit of a jigsaw for our members, so that if one piece of guidance changes, we can just pull that out and update that document rather than completely re-releasing one massive document all the time. So making sure that you've not only just done your infection control SOP. So if the CQC came to you and said, and we're assessing you and said, can you please show me your triage procedure? And you're thinking, oh no, we've only done the in-surgery and we've got the donning and the doffing, and we've got the but we don't have that written down. So they're looking for that you've got all of that covered. They're looking that you've formally calculated your air changes per hour in order to figure out your fallow time. So you need to be able to justify that to them. Equipment validation, specifically around air extraction and air purifiers. So are you in line with the manufacturer's validation for that, to make sure that you are then be able to maintain your fallow time and therefore keep the practice safe. Fit testing certificates, do you have them on file? If you've changed masks, have you got a new fit test certificate? Proof of training, just that you've trained your team on these things. They're making sure that you've cascaded this knowledge. The SOP isn't just a document that the manager's adopted and is sitting on a shelf without the team being trained on it or being made aware of updates. And your staff risk assessment, so your staff's returning to work risk assessments, they've been really keen on. They might be keen on returning to work. The new ones, the double vaccine. Oh, I've forgotten what it's called. I'm so sorry. The return to work risk assessments for people who've been vaccinated and have had a household contact. So, but to be honest, you should generally be avoiding that unless you absolutely have to have that person in. So they'll be looking at that. Hot topics. Just what we've done is we've looked at we've looked at a lot of the inspections that have been done since April. There's something like 500 and something, I think. And we've looked at all the practices that have failed, and then plus some more. So what we've seen is GDPR computer screens. This is not a major theme, but it's interesting. More than one inspector commented on computer screens being left on. So I just reinforce that with the team. CPD oversight is really interesting because obviously the enhanced CPD came in 2018, and that added a duty to practices that I don't think everyone has quite got a grip on at the moment, which is that or it's slow coming through, but the CQC are looking at more and more now, which is that your team have to have a 5-year PDP to be compliant with GDC standards, and they need to be on top of that PDP and doing their minimum hours per year. I saw when I was looking at this multiple inspections where they said the practice could not assure itself that the team were doing this and are on top of this. These were failed practices. I don't think it's the reason they failed. And I don't think it would tip you over the edge, but I think it would be a contributing factor. Is that you need this CPD oversight. This is the reason why in the iLearn platform, formerly Istafarm, we have the practice reporting in there, which enables a practice to all of your team to give permission to you to check that they're on top of their PDPs. So you have a dashboard there that if the CQC turn up and say what's going on with the CPD, you can just click and show it. Again, if you want to have a chat with the team about that, or if, to be honest, I think we've got something like 75% of the profession using Icefarm, so probably half of your team are, but that's something else you can talk to our new business team about. It's like how to bring that into your suite of Agilio products. So decontamination lead education. This is huge. Every single practice that I looked at that failed had a comment about the fact that the decontamination lead didn't understand HTML 105. So going back to what I was saying earlier, so then that leads to poor auditing, poor policies, poor procedures, training, and having the digital audit I showed earlier is great. You'd need training as well, definitely. So making sure your decon leads are trained as well. Indemnity sessions. Yeah, they're looking to check that your team are indemnified for the right number of sessions, which is something they haven't looked at historically. And I think where this has come from is probably during the pandemic, they've ramped down slightly on people have been doing less, so they've maybe reduced their indemnity a bit, but then they've started doing more. So they may be indemnified for 8 sessions a week and they're doing 10. So you need to assure yourself that this person is indemnified, that your associates, your GDC registrants are indemnified. Delegation and empowerment culture is huge. I could do a whole webinar on this, and I think I will do a whole webinar on culture in dental practice and changing your culture and how to positively influence it and what that's about. I think there's a lot of misunderstanding on what culture is and how you can affect it, and it's so powerful. Yeah, I won't go. I could talk for another half an hour on that, but I won't. And the CQC getting tougher? The pass rate right now is at about 80%, which is interesting. So we'll talk about that a little bit more. So right, so we're now moving into what's sort of happening now, and then we're going to jump into the strategy and have a look and pull some bits out of that. So the CQC pass rate in 2021 right now is at about 80%. Which is the lowest that I've seen it since about April 2015, when the fundamental standards came in and the CQC started looking for quality assurance. The pass rates went from like high 90s to like 80%, 1 in 5 practices falling down on the inspection overnight, and that's mostly because practices were just doing audits and weren't doing quality assurance. That was probably the main reason. They weren't doing follow-ups or actions. They were just ticking the box, and maybe the person who was doing it wasn't qualified. So I think there's a couple of things going on here. I think firstly, what the CQC are doing, to be fair, is the CQC are doing a TMA or a direct monitoring call now. If that monitoring call triggers something, then they go and inspect. If a practice hasn't had an inspection in a long time, they may go and inspect. And if they get a whistleblower or any problems, they'll go and inspect. So they don't publish the TMA reports, which I think is interesting because we'll talk about this a bit later. They don't actually publish those reports. So the people they're inspecting are higher risk, which means that pass rate will go down. So I think that's partially what's going on. I think just that chain of how they sort of are screening the practices means that it's more likely that a practice they visit will not pass the inspection. I think on the other side of it, I think they are getting a little bit tougher in that we've had 10 years to learn the standards. I mean, if you're not compliant, if you've had your practice for the last 10 years and you're not compliant with HTML 105 now, then maybe the CQC can be tough on you. I think we'd probably all agree on that. They've increased their focus on knowledge, culture, competence, delegation, empowerment. They're looking at it as a business as well, as it were, just seeing, is this somewhere that's nice to work, that treats its team well, that has a learning culture and everything. And so I think that's affecting some of the more, maybe the more autocratic practices, should we say. But also then there's a shorter time frame between follow-up inspections. That's another thing I've noticed, is they seem to be going out a lot more quickly and being a lot more tenacious with that. I think that maybe comes from them feeling that, and again, this is just my interpretation, feeling that we've had enough time for this to embed in. They did say it almost 3 years ago. I can't remember which presentation it was. They sort of said, we've kind of been helping the profession for ages. So they're about helping us, but they're also, we need to get a move on a little bit. Right. So I'm going to go quite quick. I've just noticed the time, and this is the bit that I imagine a lot of you are here for. But the most important bit has probably come before, which is that next year they're going to be contacting practices doing this direct monitoring. They're going to be really focusing on certain things, and I've given you most of the key areas where where a practice can fall down. So hopefully you've taken those things from those and you're thinking about how you can deal with those, because for the next 12 months, that bit's probably the most important bit that's going to help you. This bit's probably the most interesting bit, but that's the really helpful bit, I'd say. So new strategy, not tactics. So as I said before, the difference between 2015 and 2021 is that the CQC really were consulting in 2014. They were sending out draft versions of what they were doing, and it was very much like, this is what we're doing with the dental profession. We've not really seen a lot of that engagement. We had a little bit before the pandemic, and I think that's for two reasons. As I said, I think it's because we're lower risk, and I think it's because we're lower risk, and I also think because of the pandemic. So I think those two together means that we're down the list of when they want to implement this for dentistry. So it's new strategy, not tactics. So I think it's always good. There's some people out there that, or some organisations out there that I think have marketed maybe a little bit aggressively on this, and that the CQC have changed their strategy. Sign up for our course where you're going to learn everything that the CQC are doing. But the CQC haven't told us for dentistry at all. They've set the direction. Strategy is direction. Tactics. So at the top of the CQC, John Milne, Rosie Bennyworth, the sort of the C-suite and the top level guys in the CQC have gone, okay, these are the things that we want to achieve. But then generally speaking, in any organization, it's the same in ours in Agilio, it's then up to the senior managers to translate that into tactics and to come up with things and go back to the guys and go, what, like this? Or are you thinking like this? And to sort of craft the implementation of the strategy, which I think is where the CQC are now. And I think this is what we're going to see coming through. But pulling into some things that you can see in this. So I'm just going to whiz through these. There's different themes in the different themes there: people and communities, safety through learning, accelerating improvement, and smarter regulation, which is the one that we really want to be focusing on. But looking at certain things, CQC, sharper focus on checking for open and honest cultures. They're going to look at how we're investing and we're improving safety, that we have the right balance. They're going to provide a clearer definition of what good and outstanding care looks like. Everyone should be able to easily access this, public and the professions. And that's going to use the basis for assessing services. So some of this is coming out in a consultation at the moment, so which I'll talk about a bit. But practically, it probably doesn't mean a lot for us. It's just them tweaking a few things that will be great overall, but practically won't make a lot of difference for us. They want to move away from relying on a set schedule of inspections. They want to have a regular view and continuous knowledge, and not just a snapshot of this practice was good on this date. They're looking at how they can use artificial intelligence, innovative analysis methods. They're going to be responding to risk more. So they want to go to a risk profile where you can imagine they're going to have some sort of a dashboard with your practice name on it and a little arrow. And when that arrow, whatever affects that arrow, not quite sure, could be a direct monitoring call, or information from the BSA or something for private practices that we're not sure yet. When it hits a certain point, you'll get an inspection. So they want to respond to risk more. They're going to build relationships with providers and partners. Own self-assurance and accreditation. So accreditation is being discussed again. We have the quality practice scheme for our members, Agilia members, and I think that potentially will be a very good way of if we can show to the CQC how transparent that is and that it is a real measure, that could be a really good way for private practices to reduce their risk. So that's something I'm exploring. And we've got quite a lot of practices on board with that at the moment. So digging into this just a little bit, and this is a little bit of, and I'll discuss these points and I'll talk about other stuff, is, a clearer and I've kind of consolidated some of the things of what they've said. A clearer definition of what good and outstanding care looks like that is easily available and used for assessing services. So I put new key line of inquiry set. This is probably more the quality statements, the I statements, the we statements, which I'll be discussing in a bit. The key lines of inquiry, the key questions: safe, is the practice safe, effective, responsive, well led? I think those are staying, but then the prompts underneath them are probably going and being replaced with I statements and we statements. But as I said earlier, this probably gives slightly clearer guidance on what the CQC might be looking at a particular time. I'll say a bit more about what it is in a sec. It gives sort of a clarity of what the CQC are looking for, but practically the regulations, the guidance aren't changing. So they're still going to be looking at your X-ray compliance. They're still going to be looking at your safeguarding. They're maybe just going to be a bit clearer on exactly what they're looking for. New guidance, I think some new guidance or consultation guidance will be coming with this maybe next year. Be interesting to see. Ratings, the ratings question, the CQC have said that obviously we are the only profession that aren't rated, or the only area that isn't rated. The whole ratings question, the CQC have said is up, I think it's with the Department of Health, and I think part of that was along the lines of, do we want to rate dentists, but then also, are we happy with the ratings, how they're working already? Because I think part of the issue with, or one of the reasons they're changing these things, is if they only visit a GP once every 4 years and they say this one's good, but that one's outstanding and that one got an inspection yesterday, then is that really fair? And especially in dentistry, where we're more like how can I put it? We're almost split retail with a caring profession, because we've got the sales aspect of private dentistry and the competition aspects that GP practices don't have. So, if you had an inspection 5 years ago and then someone opens a practice next door and gets an immediate inspection that is outstanding and you're at good, then that's not necessarily a true reflection on you. So there's a lot of complexities around this question, and I think it's inevitable that we'll get rated, because we stick out like a sore thumb by not being rated. But I think there's a bigger question before they bring it to us. Updated regulations, potentially at some point. I don't think that's anytime soon. Moving away from relying on a set schedule of inspections to having a regular view and continuous knowledge. Okay, so this is where it gets interesting, in that in order to do that, they're going to they're going to have to cross the threshold less, talk to us more, change away from inspection more to assessment with the direct monitoring. But then what happens with those direct monitoring reports? Because if that is their main way of assessing practices and assessing more regularly, then they're not currently publishing them. But I think they probably have to publish them to have the transparency. Otherwise, we're only going to see a report when someone gets inspected. Also on that front, they have said that they're consulting on what the outputs of their monitoring and assessing activity is. So I think that what they've said is, who are they writing that report for? Is it for the general public or is it for the profession? Because the 10-page report you get from passing or falling down on your inspection is very detailed and great for you, but to a member of the public it probably reads very confusingly. So, but how do they find a balance between that? So if they want to increase this frequency from 10%, what does it become? I would imagine maybe somewhere around 30% or something like that. So, you could say an inspection once every 3 years, or not an inspection, an assessment, which could be a direct monitoring call or could be crossing the threshold. That said, but then with all of this, which gets interesting, is that then they're not going to have the resources to do this. as someone who's managed consultancy teams, I know that, sending someone out to a practice or trying to get 2 practices done in a day is difficult. If you're sat at home, maybe you can do it depending on how short it is, but you're not really going to find massive efficiency, and they're not going to be able to suddenly triple what they do with the same workforce. So they're going to have to get more resources, and the CQC runs a balanced book. Therefore, the fees will have to go up. For this strategy to work for dentistry and implemented, inevitably it'll mean a fee increase. But what's interesting about that is that the CQC have not consulted on fees for this next financial year, for 2022 to 23. So the fees aren't going to go up until April 23 at the earliest. So are we now seeing any major change to regular contact being delayed for dentistry till 2023 because they're not going to have the funds to run that balanced book? So I think that's quite interesting. I think these changes are coming, but when are they coming? Because how are they going to have the funds to do this? Increased use of digital submission. This is something we find really interesting. Obviously, with having iComply and having, the data that, well, not us having the data, you having your data. How can we make it possible for you to very easily submit stuff remotely to the CQC? So that's something that we're working on for our members, that, if you're doing well with your compliance and it's obvious in the system and you're using the digital audit tools and everything like that, then is there a data set there within iComply that you can just ping it off to the CQC and it will just lower your risk, because it's really clear, it's not fudgeable, which is the other bit that we need to that we want to just make sure. It's really interesting. Obviously said responding to risk, increased importance of image management I've put there. So, this is something we've spoken about way historically when the CQC were talking about intelligent monitoring. But what can you do to control to bring your risk factor down? So, if the CQC is out there and they're looking for that information, if you are on an accreditation scheme like ours, can you put it on your website? If, are you scouring anywhere that people can make a review for you and comment and replying, or are the negative reviews remaining unanswered about you, that if the CQC come up with an AI that can literally go out there, they put in the name of the practice and it goes on, it looks on reviews.com and it looks on everything, that starts pulling all of this stuff together, what picture does that give of you of how much you care about being responsive to your members? So I think that's quite interesting. And then the last one on there is using insight with our relation, increased use of NHS data. As I've said, they will absolutely be tying in APIs into the NHS, the BSA data, but then that leaves this massive gap for private practices, because how can they equally assess? Because by that definition, let's just imagine all practices are good for a second and all the NHS data is good. If they pull in that NHS data for all those NHS practices, they immediately get a lower risk rating than the private practices because data doesn't exist. So how can they make that fair? Okay, so if we look down to the end of this, 2022, 23 and beyond. So the things that we think are probably coming are provider information returns, which I'll touch on in a second. GPs do these annually, care homes do these annually. It's been coming for us for a long time, and I'm pretty sure that'll happen next year. An annual sort of self-audit. They do it, HIW do it for dentists, and the CQC have spoken about it and said that they're looking into it for as a potential for dentistry. Frequency increase could be next year or maybe not, depending on the fees, as I've said. Change to assessment, absolutely next year, they've done it now, in that the direct monitoring is an assessment, the phone call. But I think if they are going this way, they're going to need to publish those results, because if that's where it stops, how are they going to show the public that they've done their job for that practice if that doesn't affect something, or you can't see that anywhere? Fee increases, I think probably 2023, 24. New CLOEs potentially, and then we quality statements, clearer definitions. I'll touch on that for a second. And then CQC in 2022 and beyond. I'm probably repeating what I just said mostly, but no initial change, I don't think. It's relatively low risk. Annual provider information returns, I'm positive are coming, and I'm sure it'll be next year. The direct monitoring approach we've discussed, increased contact, who knows, increased fees, and I've pretty much covered all the other stuff. But I think consultations, the one thing we haven't seen is any consultation. So if they were going to change anything significantly in dentistry, they wouldn't do it without consulting. So outstanding questions on that, I guess, for me, I've got more than these, but just sort of outstanding questions that myself and the team are talking to the CQC about regularly. We're keeping our ear to the ground. We're signed up to the consultation platforms. We're really involved in this in our members, and I think this is what has, this is historically what's differentiated us from a lot of our competitors, is that we are sort of research focused compliance department. We are very much about figuring out what's going on, seeing how we can get involved, how we can influence, how we can add value and help the profession and the CQC at the same time, because I think bringing the two together is really important. So when is any specific dental consultations coming? We don't know yet. I thought we were going to get some before Christmas. We've not had any yet. When will we be receiving any draft guidance? If we do get some, it'll probably come with the consultations. When we'll be asked to fill out an annual PIR, I thought that would be before the end of this year as well, but I'm positive it'll come next year. When will they be contacting us more regularly, and when will the fees go up? As I said, those two questions are probably really tightly linked. Will we be rated? Don't know. And will they publish those DMA reports? PIRs, I won't go into this in lots of detail. They're annual, they're digital, they're risk indicators. Will they be themed? Who knows? Will they do a safe PIR, provider information return, a self-audit essentially? I think what they hinted at one of the presentations was they're just going to start off with asking a few questions and just get the ball rolling and on starting it, but I'm not sure when. Direct monitoring approach. From what we can tell, it's exactly the same as the TMA at the moment, and we were the first in the profession to provide the guide to our members. I personally sat in a dark room for an entire weekend and put this together. It's been used successfully for hundreds of practices on the calls, and yeah, we've got a really good template there for our members. So if you are not a member and you think you're going to get one of these calls, it's a very good reason to join us, is to get access to this information. CQC developing their regulatory model. I'll just touch on this for a second, because there are different consultations going on with the CQC, but the ones I'm most interested in are the ones that practically affect how you manage what you need to do in your practice and your time management and what you need to do. This one's a little bit more to do with, you can see there with the quality statements. At the moment, we've got the key lines of inquiry. They have prompts underneath them, which are like sub-questions. They've found these to be quite unwieldy, I think, and not necessarily helpful to the general public, or helpful but not super helpful to the general public and to the professions on what they want to do. So what they've done is they're doing consultation. They're working closely with stakeholder patient engagement groups, and they're developing what they're calling quality statements, I statements and we statements. So the I statement is on behalf of the patient, so they'd be linked to a key line of inquiry, like I will get this from my practice, or this will happen when I am there. And then the we statements are defining what we do. So they're sort of instead of the prompts, they're we will do this, we will do that, and they're kind of routes to evidence, as it were, or they're statements to sort of check compliance against, and they're directly going to be linked to the regulations. Again, this is taken from one of the CQC's webinars. This is on YouTube, so I hope if there's anyone from the CQC, they don't mind that I just took this one slide. It's not mine, I didn't create it, but I thought it would just good to see where it sits between the evidence and the 5 key questions. So it's sort of taking the space of where the prompts are now. As you said there, it's clearer and more widely applicable. So just some examples of some of the stuff that they've been asking questions about in consultations. And the first one I think is just really interesting, because one theme that I haven't really mentioned that does seem to be coming out a bit is that the CQC are going to be looking at environmental sustainability. I need to check this to see exactly under what regulations they're looking at it, because to me, instinctively, it feels slightly like an overreach. But they'll have found a way to link it to the regulations. But this, to me, is actually probably practically the only real thing that I'm seeing changing is of what they're looking at is that around environmental impact. But you can see examples here of different ones for environmental sustainability, leadership capacity capability, and infection prevention and control. So these are going to get rid of are going to replace those prompts. But again, practically, I don't think this means a lot, because HTML 105 is still HTML 105, no matter what the we statement says about it. There might be some nuance in there, but I've not gone deep into this. If someone really wants me to sort of pull this stuff out and do a webinar on it, I can. I just don't know what the value is massively. And I thought the other stuff showing, rather than going deep into this, it was better to show the other stuff today. And at the bottom there, you can see there's a hyperlink. The CQC want people to engage and be involved in their consultations, and surprisingly few people do get involved. So if you are interested in getting involved, you can sign up on that link at the bottom and or request to be part of it at the bottom. So I'd encourage anyone who is interested to get involved. So just chatting a little bit about us again, and you know, what we've done. Agilia, you know, I'd say you need a trusted partner. You know, hopefully that would be us. Doesn't need to be us, but hopefully you've seen the way we think, the way we're looking at things, and we're trying to stay ahead of the game as always, and as we have done since 2015, which is why our, you know, our practices had a 98% pass rate in 2015 when the profession had an 80% pass rate, and we're geared up for whatever change comes next year or something. We will be ahead of it, and we will be planning and working on the software. So right now, obviously, we've got the digital tools in iComply. There's consultancy for anyone who's interested in it. iLearn's got the PDP and the CPD management we were discussing. iTeam has the mandatory documents. And there's a load of free webinars on the website as well, where I'm talking about leadership, management, auditing, risk assessing. So there's a lot of free resources, even if you're not a member, there for you. And I just thought, for those of you who are members, just a little bit of an insight on what we're doing right now and what our plans are. So right now with iComply, we're working towards a January iComply launch of what we're currently iComply is version 3, so this will probably be called version 4. And we're doing a big project of simplification, configuration, streamlining. You know, we've been around for 40 years, and we think that we've got enough knowledge now of what the CQC are doing and enough real-time information to be able to really make iComply configurable for people, and also some really exciting change around helping you prioritize as well. Because there's a lot of compliance and there's a lot of laws and regulations, but if you just want to focus on the really important things, like the sort of things I was just showing in this webinar earlier on, how can we help you when you've got half an hour and you just want to know, okay, iComply, tell me what's the best use of my next half an hour. So really interesting stuff. We've gone through iComply and we've removed 13% of the activities. A lot of consolidation going on and bringing stuff together. We've keyworded 500 documents. Our members were telling us that sometimes they couldn't find stuff when they searched, so we've re-keyworded every single document in iComply. We've reviewed and improved all the activity titles to give you clear direction of what's being done. And the bottom thing that you can see there on the application changes, I won't go into all of them. We've got lots of exciting things to come with different calendar views, simplification of the UI. iComply in January is going to look very different to iComply in December. So we're really excited to bring you the sort of the new look on it, the slick, sort of streamlined version that's going to help you still do everything, but help you to prioritize, and hopefully we're going to be able to do real-time updates of those based on inspection reports and our whole sort of mechanism for looking at what's important right now. So really, really, really exciting. And then going into just a bit on product launch, and this is just January to March next year. I really wanted to tell you what's happening in April, May, and June, but I think we don't want to tip our hand too much on what we're doing. But we've got the iComply, I've called it iComply 4 launch there for January, the new and improved, or just massively streamlined and improved, which is great. Time and attendance for iTeam is coming as an add-on module there. Time and attendance chart, like there will be a charge to pay for it, not too much, but this will enable your team to log in and log out, and you'll be able to give that information to payroll. So if that's something that excites you and interests you, you know, the pop-up will come up again in a minute. And then one of our new services that we're working on is iService. Not maybe for every practice. Some practices will love this. Groups, if you've got a group of practice, if you've got more than one practice, you will love this. It's going to enable you to track all your engineering visits, to have a one-stop shop source of information and portal for all those certificates, and to know what needs to be done and when across your estate. So that's fantastic. And then yeah, I can't talk about the Q1, the financial Q1 next year. Okay, so that is pretty much me. I've covered sort of like the key. So the main thing is not much is changing next year. I've covered the key 2015 to 2021 themes, gone through the hot topics, what we're seeing right now in our research, touched on the SOP compliance. We've gone through the CQC strategy, and I've pulled out some of the consultation bits that I think are the most interesting, made some predictions, and told you what I think is coming and when it's coming. And we've had a quick discussion about finding a trusted partner. So for those of you who are still here, and I know some people, I'm sorry it's gone further on, and I wasn't able to get it all in before 2 o'clock. For those of you who are still here in the chat, can you just tell me, did we cover what you wanted us to cover? And then I'll move on to some questions. Were you happy with that?